Welcome to Lunch with Tech Leaders, where we have engaging conversations about software development and cloud engineering with industry leaders and subject matter experts. These episodes are created by the Great Lakes Tech Leaders, an online community of technology practitioners. Please come join the conversation by visiting gltl.rbn.ai. Again, that's gltl.rbn.ai. Now strap in, because we're deploying to production in 3, 2, 1.
Ooh. Welcome everybody to Lunch with Tech Leaders, hosted by the Great Lakes Tech Leaders Discord server. First one on the server. Welcome everybody. My name's Adam Oberhausen. I work with Right Brain Networks here in Ann Arbor, and we're trying to build this community and help folks network, learn, talk about interesting topics. And today's topic is how to think like a software architect. So full disclosure, I am not a software architect, so don't consider me an expert. But I brought some folks here who are experts, and I will introduce them and allow them to introduce themselves. First up, we've got Tom Kowalski. Tom, want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, howdy. Tom here. I had the title of Chief Architect at DaySmart Software. We did small business software solutions. Did that for about 16 years. And I've just recently started consulting, so doing custom software and data. So that's me.
And someone on the Right Brain team who I consider an internal expert we have, Jason Brown, if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hey there, good afternoon. Yeah, Jason Brown here. So I'm also similar to Adam, working at Right Brain Networks. I've been with the company for about 8.5 years now, with a background in software development and slowly sort of shifting gears into more of a cloud solutions architect role. But happy to be part of the conversation.
Great, thanks, Jason and Tom. Anyone on the call have would if they'd like to speak up and say, "Hey, I'm a software architect," or "My role is in the architect area"? I'd love to hear from people on the call right now to say, hey, just speak up and let us know what you're doing and how you've been involved with architecture.
Hi, I'm Spencer Thomas. I'm a technical architect at Ithaca. Been formally in that role for over a decade, but probably thinking architecturally for longer than that.
Great. Anybody else?
Lancelot Carlson. I've been running tech teams for a long time. Have been in various architectural roles. So yeah, I think about this stuff on a pretty regular basis.
Awesome. So I did put together a Google Doc that I just posted in the chat. Should be open to everyone, but just some things, just some thoughts, and what I've come across in my learnings of software architecture. By no means a definitive guide, but I think it's I recently read a book called Clean Architecture, which is by Robert C. Martin, and it was tough to follow, I'll be honest, but I was able to glean some of the core concepts of it. He also wrote another book called Clean Code, which is I think written in the 90s, but still very relevant today. So yeah, I mean, I guess I'll just kick it off with what I thought was a really interesting way to the goal of software architecture, which is cost reduction. The role of the architect is to reduce the cost of development, deployment, and maintenance of the system. You want to keep the manpower required to develop, deploy, and maintain the system to the lowest level possible. Is any thoughts on that is that the goal of architecture as you guys see it, or is there other thoughts there?
So I was editing this document earlier. I think there's a sort of a, not to be pedantic about the wording, but I think that businesses Their main objective is to be able to, adapt and change quickly as market forces pressure them to do so. And if your system is not set up in a way that makes it easy and conducive to change, that's where you run into issues. So the word maintenance and, and whatnot, like, I think the word I'm looking for is change, being easy to change. And there are definitely processes that are more conducive to doing that, especially in a production environment.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with you, Lance. But I think, I'm really wowed that it kind of boils up like that. Adam, you kind of hit the nail on the head there. Like almost everything that I can think of kind of could be identified as like cost reduction in some form, right? Like performance is cost reduction. Like having a highly performant application is like cost reduction in your, you know, oh, I don't know.
I get what you're saying. It really surprised me too, though, when like I was watching a video series and the guy was like, "Oh, this should be obvious. It's cost reduction," and I was like, "What?" I was like, "I thought it was to design a clean system," but I mean, when you look at what the cost reduction means in terms of architecture, it is keeping the manpower required to deploy and maintain the system at the lowest level, deploy and change the system. Tom, what do you got?
I'd like to say that's just half of it, right?
Okay.
Yeah, the cost is one thing, but it's the value to the customers. That's number one, right? You want to drive costs down so that you can keep providing value, right, and bringing in more revenue. So yeah, I'd say the other side of it, like was mentioned before, is being able to change quickly, right?
Mhm.
Making it so that the software is adaptable to provide value to your customers quickly.
Yeah, that kind of gets into the some of the pitfalls where it's like you've got, when you talk about delivering value to stakeholders, you've got what the behavior of the application. You want your application to behave in a way that makes or saves money for the stakeholders. That's really the essence of all software. And most programmers think that like that's the most important thing. The other value you're delivering to the stakeholder is the word software itself. Soft meaning the system is flexible or can be easily changed. And the where is the product. So I think a lot of times you'll see organizations prioritize number one over number two. But it's much better to have an application that doesn't quite work but can be easily changed versus an application that quote unquote works but cannot be easily changed.
So when I saw that goal as cost reduction, I hadn't ever thought about it that way. And I'm still kind of processing that idea. And I think one of the potential pitfalls, if you will, in using that term is that as architects, we need to think long term. So we're talking about cost reduction over the entire life cycle of the product, not cost reduction over the next quarter or the next year even necessarily. And I think when you got to frame it, because otherwise you end up making short-term decisions with long-term impacts.
Yeah, it's like the quadrant, right, of like the cost, right, versus revenue, and then short-term, long-term, right, and it's balancing that with like the business goals, right, your OKRs.
Well, I take a little bit of a stance on the other side a little bit. All businesses are different. All customers, they're all little snowflakes, right? But ultimately, the end user, the end consumer, you need to deliver them value, and you need to develop. So maybe it is an end consumer that doesn't need that much change, and they just need something that performs well. Whatever the you want to build software to the constraint of what is delivering customer value in the marketplace uniquely, at the best clip right now.
Yeah. Whenever I, went into a project or we're working on something, it's that balance, right? You think about the long term and you think like, okay, how could it change? What might happen? But you just keep that in the back of your mind. But then you deliver on that value now, like thinking about it, as you're making those choices to deliver value now to your customers and making those choices, you're kind of going in a path that allows you to change and move towards that the further goal, the longer term goal.
Right. And I'm not saying like every 2 weeks you need to be delivering customer value. I'm a big proponent, and I like this process by 37 Signals called Shape Up. And instead of like the traditional agile iteration of 2 weeks and this crazy sprint planning stuff, like you could scale it out to 6 weeks of like, this is a feature I want to develop. The constraint is 6 weeks, and whatever comes out of that 6 weeks is what you get. And there's a whole process of working with the stakeholder and working with the developer and designer of that feature that is really interesting. And 6 weeks is like just enough time where it's like you have to make decisions at especially towards the end of the 6 weeks, but like it's also enough breathing room to get creative about what we're delivering, what value we're delivering to the customer.
You mind posting a link to that in the chat here?
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you. Okay, so I think we're talking a lot about, we want to deliver value as architects, and like, can anyone share like an example from real world where they've, had a project, were in charge of the architecture of it, and how you went about it, and just kind of walk us through what it was like and what were you trying to overcome and how did it go? Crickets.
Kind of really open there, right? Like describe like any
Yeah, how about, maybe like a serverless project, Tom, something that you architected, how you established what it would.
Yeah, so in my experience, right, especially over the last few years, it's not so much like a single project, right? Like my role is more the integration, right, the alignments of all of the projects and things like that. And I feel like it's kind of more important, right? It depends on the team what they want to do for like a single project application. But so there's a motto, right, a mantra or whatever, that's made famous by Netflix, is the loosely coupled, highly aligned. And I relate that to everything, right? It all kind of comes back to it. Any of the design choices and things like that. So yeah, kind of like my overall, thinking about it is making sure that there's alignment between all of the projects, right? They're, the same type of standards of the data, right, and how it's integrated and things like that. But then once it comes down to it, it's kind of on the team to make their own choices of like the technology, like the underlying part of each project.
Okay, very good. There. Anybody else have anything to add on their personal experiences with architecture and how they go about it?
I'm trying to sort of pull out a coherent example, but I don't know, sort of what sort of realm each of us works in. In my case, we have built and are continuing to iterate on a large web-based software platform. Maybe many of you are doing that, which has actually been in existence through multiple technology iterations since 1997. And we've got like 20 different engineering teams. And so the Netflix mantra was one that we picked up early, of independent and aligned, because with over 100 developers on 20 teams working on different parts of a system that all have to work together, we need to give everybody the independence to do implementation in the way that works for them, but also the dependence of making sure that everything interoperates. And so one of the non-development roles that we architects find ourselves in is modeling and encouraging sort of systems level thinking among the engineers. Because one of my experiences, especially with younger software engineers, is that they tend to be very focused on the thing that they're working on at the moment, and not always considering how it fits into the system as a whole, how it fits into this cooperating suite of over 100 different applications all working together to provide one product. And I don't really know how to cohere that into like a single example at this point.
No, but it's great insight, Spencer. Like, I think it's basically, I think in my document, I say a good architect must continue to be familiar with and/or write code, and a good developer must participate in the design. You can't just have developers writing a Jira, working on a Jira ticket in a bubble without kind of at least taking a step back and thinking about how this piece fits into the whole puzzle is what you're trying to articulate, right? So I think that's really insightful.
Yeah, I think it really comes down to how you're organized, right? I think it's like Conway's law, right? How your teams are organized, right? Is how your software is organized and communicates. So it goes hand in hand, and that does, the other side of being a software architect is working with the rest of the business on that organizational structure of the individual teams, owning the project, right? Owning the solutions, owning that customer value, and how that plays in with the rest of the company, right? It's like the whole DevOps thing of not having your company separated, the infrastructure here, QA over there, right? And having each team owning those solutions, kind of directly translates to how that software is architected.
Yeah, I'd also like to chime in as well with a personal experience, which kind of dovetails in with what you were talking about. Well, actually, with both what you were both talking about, Spencer and Tom. So this is quite a few years ago now, but we had been helping out a client because they had sort of gotten themselves, they've dug themselves into a hole. I mean, they had a monolithic application that was gigantic. And it was there were so many different interconnected dependencies between all of the different components. And they had the problem of that they were not able to adapt quickly enough to address the shifting scope of requirements and really fulfill the value that they needed to fulfill for their stakeholders and end users. So we were brought in to help develop a strategy for breaking down the monolith and actually separating it into components that were more narrow in scope, easily adaptable, so that they can continue moving forward and adapting and changing without the problems that they had been experiencing. I mean, when you'd make one change, they'd have a whole bunch of different components that would have to change along with it, and it just extended the time to be able to address issues and get that out to market. So that was a really interesting experience, being able to go in there really learn the app inside and out, and then just start to separate things along behavioral lines. Like what are the reasons for components X, Y, and Z changing? Really untangling the web of dependencies. And what was interesting too is what we found is that a lot of it was it was easier to restructure at the component level than we thought, but a lot of the data was really closely tied together at the database level, at the data level, and so we really had to work backwards and to really analyze. Okay, well, what parts of what is the nature of the data that we are handling, and which components are handling that data, and what, like, really narrowing the scope of what different types of data are necessary for certain components. I know I'm kind of like speaking in generalities because I can't get into too much of the details, but yeah, just wanted to share that with the group.
Really? That I can really relate to that, because within a company, it's kind of hard to have the disparate data sources, right? Within each service, there's going to be duplicate stuff, right? Within domain-driven design, right? It's you could have a customer in each different section of the software, in each different component, right? That has different values and things like that. And I think that is the hardest thing, when working with teams, is they feel like there should only be one, right, like source of truth within everything. So it's really hard for them to have data that is kind of the same in the different systems. But what really helps with me in conveying that to the teams is to think about your team, right? Your application, your component that you're developing. Think about it like it's another company, like a separate service that you're charging for, and you could charge other teams for, and that helps them get in the mindset of thinking about those boundaries, right? Of okay, it is its own application that you may not charge for it or whatever, but thinking about it like how other teams can consume it. If you think about that app, like it is going to be to the world, and we are going to charge for it, this API or whatever. It allows them to visualize and think about it more, those boundaries.
I like establishing the boundary based on something that you're going to service. To me, a couple of things. First of all, does that web service, that thing you spun off, does that web service have to be a web service that is only consumed internally? How do you create services that are delivering direct customer value versus internal value only? That can be a big problem when you're setting up the project and trying to get adoption from other people in the organization. Another thing I want, and I don't want to be the controversial person here always, but I do like to ask the interesting questions. Is that, like, do you always have to break down the monolith? Like, at what point do you have to make that decision? Because as soon as you start breaking down the monolith, a monolith by itself isn't a problem. It's that those boundaries weren't defined to begin with as components. And you're spot on when you're saying, okay, the database is where you really have to look to make sure that you're getting the stuff, the data that aligns together correct. And when you do have everything, it's a little bit simpler to do migrations in the beginning. When you do have everything still in a monolith, like, I think that people are going straight for these microservices and web services too quickly sometimes. Mm-hmm. And
I totally agree.
Yeah, I think people need
buzzwords and synergy that they chase. Right. Like, it's not. Tom and I have a lot of experience with dealing with monoliths, and it's like a lot of times a business doesn't have the focus to, like, think about what it takes to break down a monolith into microservices. That if you're dealing with a 20-year-old code base, that could take years, right? So our approach was, like, whenever we do a new thing or we develop a new feature, let's try to create that as its own quote unquote service, or just create its own component. Just make it, like Tom said, like it's its own service, business almost, that operates independent of whatever the monolith is doing. and that kind of also builds momentum about breaking up the monolith, because as teams go back and work on the monolith, they'll say, oh, well, like this thing is sending, emails. Like, why don't we break this out of the monolith and put, just stand up an email service that uses SES or something?
Why do we need to break the monolith? Because as soon as you start breaking the monolith, you have to start thinking about events. You have to start thinking about eventual consistency. You have to think about redundant data, like you guys were talking about before. You have to, and then you break down one of the most powerful things that the database gives you if you're using a relational database, which is the SQL, a relational bit, which, you get to query anything across. You just replicate your database, and now you have something that your BI people can query easily.
Yeah, I have nothing against the monolith. In our situation, we were acquiring companies and trying to leverage services across them. So that was kind of where that came in. And I'm completely okay with the monolith. The only thing is there has to be a team, right? And then a hierarchy, like one team owning it, like end to end, or like at least owning it, right? And then treating other teams like they're contracting out like this piece or that piece. The problem that I've seen with the monoliths is that it kind of becomes no one's responsibility once you start to have multiple teams, and then no one cares about performance, or not doesn't care, but it's kind of not my responsibility, or security or things like that. So I'm okay with the monolith as long as there's one team that owns it, right? It owns that security, owns the performance, owns the value that it's driving, and then the other teams, it's being contracted out. I'd like to say, right? It's like another company to work on the different pieces and aspects and things like that.
I can talk about why we broke the monolith, 7 years ago now. Because before, when we had a monolithic application, we were managing to get between 3 and 4 releases out a year, and we were not able to do all the feature changes that we wanted to do in that process. And now we're having hundreds of releases a week, and new features at a much higher rate. I feel really with better stability. So that's how it worked for us. But I totally understand that it's not the way it's going to work for everybody.
I think you can still release a lot if you have a monolith, if you do feature flagging and other things that can help.
Like I said,
it comes back to the architecture of that monolith, I think, too, right? Like you can have a monolith that's like has boundaries, has it's still component based, and as long as it comes back to having good architecture. If the effort to change the system is low, then the architecture is good. If the effort to change the system climbs over time, then the architecture of your monolith probably needs some work.
Where monoliths fall on their face is when your testing framework is running for days, and that's a big problem. But like as soon as you start spinning off services, you still need some sort of integration testing framework that hits those web services with your front end application. To me though, you got to really think hard before spinning off services, just because it's like, your integration framework, your integration testing should be pretty good. And every time you want to set that up, it's got to be, there's a lot of components that you have to redo, which is set up your CI and everything else, and then make sure that your CI pulls in everything in the environment and integration tests everything.
Well, I totally agree about the testing, right? If your tests are taking too long to run because you've got just everything under the sun under that thing, that's a really good point. But before we're close on time here, I did want to bring up the fact, like, what if you've got something that's just small in scope and there's not really any developers at a company, right? We just made a decision in a company that I've been helping. They don't really have any in-house developers. Maybe one day they will, but everybody's a contractor, and they're just trying to get some app off the ground. The app is basically just provides access, or the API just provides access to data that's collected through IoT. And if we were to split all of these like little, basically every table off into its own service, the RBAC, which is exactly what we're really concerned about in this API, is a lot harder. So we decided that microservices wasn't the right fit for this application and this organization. So there's many reasons that you might want to choose one or the other. And I think, organization size and who's going to be working on this code, and, it comes into that maintainability, right?
Yeah, I think I like to
Absolutely.
come back to that Kanye's law or whatever, where it's Kanye. Kanye's law, Jesus, is, the organization of teams is really how your services shake up. Like once you start getting to hundreds of people in an organization, the boundaries are more about the humans involved and not so much like you really want smaller teams, like maybe 5 people on a project. Like I can see where like a larger organization, maybe it would make sense, these separate projects, especially then you get the advantage of these deployment, these separate deployment performance considerations, right? Because a separate web service can be spun up and spun down, and it has its own like requirements for making sure it doesn't pollute the rest of the environment with events and stuff that's going to corrupt the rest of the system. It has its own performance characteristics. I definitely appreciate when one service is getting when one part of your business value is getting oversized load, and then monoliths do fall on its face. But I have consistently seen that like pushing so much into microservices is one of those things that I feel like we should rein back a little bit. And SOA, service-oriented architecture, has been around forever, is better when you're thinking, like, you should think about the teams, the business value, and really think about why you're doing that before you do it.
Well stated. Well, guys, I think this is a great conversation in a topic that we're going to continue to explore through the community. So want to be respectful of everyone's time. Want to thank all the guests for being here. I want to thank the co-hosts, Tom Kowalski and Jason Brown. And, this is the first of many of our Lunch with Tech Leaders on the Discord server. I'm glad to see so many people here. And I think we're going to sign off now. But I'm going to hang around for a few minutes if people want to just chit-chat. But I am going to stop the recording now. And, thanks again, everyone. See you next week.